He was never here. My brother said it flatly, without looking at me. He said it the way people deliver conclusions they've already reached privately, as if the room were merely a formality, the decision made somewhere else, somewhere quieter, and this was only the announcement. For 3 years I managed everything. The doctors, the medications, the fall she had in December, the rehab, all of it. I drove from Louisville to Lexington twice a week, sometimes more. He sent money when I asked for it and called on Sunday afternoons and told himself that was enough. He paused. The mediator didn't speak yet. My brother glanced down at his hands. My mother knew who showed up. That's why she made the choices she made. The mediator was a woman named Ms. Ames. She had practiced probate law for 22 years before stepping back into mediation, and she wore her retirement from the bench the way certain people wear experience, quietly, without advertising it. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen she hadn't uncapped. She was watching my brother the way someone watches weather they've seen before. My name is Silas. I am 61 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers, first reviewing bridge and infrastructure specifications for federal projects across the Mid-Atlantic region, then leading a documentation integrity division that trained reviewers to identify falsified materials certifications and altered construction contracts. My final position before retirement required me to serve as the government's designated expert in 36 federal proceedings involving document fraud. My brother knew I was an engineer. He had not thought carefully about what kind. I sat on one side of the long conference table with my hands resting flat on the surface and said nothing. I had learned this in government work, that the most effective response to someone misrepresenting a situation is to let them finish. Interruption creates noise. Silence creates record. My mother, Eunice, had died 8 months earlier at the age of 79. She had lived alone in the house in Lexington where my brother and I had grown up, a pale yellow craftsman on a street full of similar houses, wide porch, deep backyard, a dogwood tree she'd planted the year I started high school. She had been sharp well into her 70s. Then she wasn't. The decline was gradual at first, as these things tend to be, and then faster than any of us were prepared for. My brother moved into the house 17 months before she died, which was practical and which I was grateful for. My daughter, who lived in Denver and is the kind of person who doesn't express gratitude in direct terms but expresses it in other ways, called me to say she was relieved her uncle was close by. I was relieved too. I visited from Cincinnati when I could, once a month, sometimes more, and I called every few days and spoke with the home care aide on the days when my mother's voice wasn't quite steady. I want to be clear about this because my brother's version differs. I was there. I was not there every day. Those are both true. The new will appeared 10 days after the funeral. My brother's attorney, a man named Stuckey from a downtown Louisville firm, produced it at a meeting he'd called at the house, presenting it as a recent expression of my mother's wishes, executed 14 months before her death, superseding the will I had last reviewed with her 4 years earlier. That will had split the estate evenly between my brother and me. The new one allocated 80% to my brother, 20% to me, with a handwritten addendum noting that his greater direct involvement in her care warranted this adjustment. I read it twice at the kitchen table of the house where I had grown up. My brother watched me read it. His wife, who had been sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, watched me too. I said, "I'd like to have my own attorney review this." My brother said, "That's your right." He said it in a tone that was already moving past me, as if the conversation were finished and we were simply waiting for me to understand that. I drove back to Cincinnati that evening. The drive is an hour and 40 minutes on clear days. It was clear. I drove slowly anyway. There is a quality that comes over me when something doesn't fit, a stillness my wife, who had died 5 years earlier from a stroke, used to call my surveying face. She said I got it when I was looking at something that hadn't been built according to spec. She meant it as a description, not a complaint. She had understood the instinct completely. Something in that will had not been built according to spec. I did not confront my brother. I did not call an attorney. I went home and sat at my desk and wrote down what I had observed. The document's formatting, the notary seal, the signature, the way the handwritten addendum's ink differed slightly from the body text, the fact that the witness line bore a name I recognized but that had no business being there. I wrote it down the way I had been trained to write things down, without conclusion, only observation. Conclusions follow from observations. You don't reverse the order. The next morning, I drove back to Lexington. My mother's house still held the smell of her, lavender and something warmer underneath, the particular combination I associated with her bedroom and the kitchen on Sunday mornings. My brother was not there. His wife was not there. I had a key. I had always had a key. This mattered later. My mother had kept a daily journal since her early 40s, not a diary in the sentimental sense. She was not a sentimental woman, or rather, she expressed sentiment through care and action rather than language. She kept a record. She wrote in it most evenings, brief entries, sometimes only a sentence or two. What she'd eaten, who she'd spoken to, what she'd noticed out the kitchen window. She also wrote when something was bothering her. This is where the journals became useful. The journals lived in a cedar chest beneath the window in her bedroom. The chest had a brass lock. The key was on her keychain, which my brother had given to her neighbor to return to the house after the service. A woman named Millicent, who had known my mother for 30 years and had pressed the keychain into my hand at the reception saying, quietly, that my mother would have wanted me to have these. She hadn't known which key was which. She just knew it should go to me. I knew which key was which. I spent 4 hours in that bedroom. I worked through the journals from the last 3 years, starting from the back. My mother's handwriting changed as I moved backward through time, steadier and more regular the further back I went, looser and larger in the final 18 months. But her words were still hers. She wrote with a clarity that her speech had sometimes lost in those final months. People with dementia often retain their written voice longer than the spoken one. I had read this somewhere. I understood it now differently. What I found was not a single smoking document. It never is. What I found was a pattern. 14 months before her death, the month the new will was supposedly executed, my mother wrote, Royce brought papers again. I told him I needed my glasses and more time. He said it was just updating routine things. I signed because he said it was fine and I was tired. I don't remember what it was. 11 months before her death, called Silas but didn't leave a message. Didn't want to worry him. Something feels wrong but I can't say what exactly. 9 months before her death, Cynthia came with more papers. Said it was the same as before, just signing again. I asked if Silas should be here, and she said it wasn't necessary. He'd already agreed. I don't think that's true, but I didn't say so. I photographed every relevant page. I did not remove anything. On the drive home, I called Deirdre. Deirdre had been a colleague of mine on a federal infrastructure review in the mid-90s. Not an attorney then, but a forensic document specialist contracted through a law firm. She'd since gotten her JD, shifted into estate litigation, and was now practicing in Columbus. I had sent her a referral once, years earlier, and she had called to thank me in a way that told me she was someone who kept careful track of who had been straight with her. These are the people you want when a situation requires precision. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The addendum, she said. Different ink? Slightly. Blue-black versus black. Could be a different pen, could be a different session. And the witness? My sister-in-law. Conflict of interest doesn't automatically void a will in Kentucky, but a court takes it seriously. What do you want? Deirdre asked. I thought about my mother writing in her journal that she'd signed something, because she was tired, and my brother said it was fine. I thought about the entry where she'd asked if I should be present and been told I'd already agreed. I want the truth visible, I said, without me having to announce it. Deirdre said that was the right instinct and the harder approach, but also the more durable one. She said we'd document quietly and let the mediation do the work. She asked if I could go about my normal life for several weeks without tipping my hand. I told her I had spent 31 years reviewing things other people had stopped noticing. I could manage a few weeks. I drove back to Lexington twice more in the following month. My brother and I had dinner once, the three of us, my brother, his wife, and me, at a steakhouse he chose. He was warm in the way people are warm when they believe they've already won. He asked about my retirement. He asked if I was getting out enough. He asked in a way that wasn't really a question, whether I was handling things all right since the funeral. I told him I was fine. I ate my dinner and asked about his son's new position and listened carefully to the things he said and the things he chose not to say. His wife watched me more carefully than he did. She always had. She was, I suspected, the one who had understood the mechanics of what they'd done more clearly than he had. She was a bookkeeper by trade, had completed a certification program some years back that included a module on estate documentation. Not a license, not a credential that authorized her to act as a witness on a will she stood to benefit from, but enough to understand what the paperwork needed to look like. Deirdre worked through proper channels. She submitted a records request for the notary's journal. In Kentucky, notaries are required to keep a contemporaneous log of every instrument they certify. The entry for my mother's will listed the appointment as a routine estate update with no indication that independent counsel was present or advised. Deirdre contacted my mother's original estate attorney, the man who had drawn up the earlier will, who confirmed he had not been consulted about any amendment and had not been present when the new document was signed. He had learned of my mother's death by mail. She located the home care aide who had worked with my mother during the relevant months. The aide remembered the afternoon my brother and his wife had arrived with documents. She remembered my mother asking twice what she was signing and being told not to worry. She had assumed it was a normal family matter. She hadn't known it was significant. Deirdre also found the voicemails. I had told her about them. 3 messages my mother had left me in her final months that I had never deleted. One of them I had saved without fully understanding why. When Deirdre asked me to play it for her over the phone, she listened without speaking until it ended. My mother's voice. Silas, it's me. I'm sorry to call so late. I've been a little confused today. Royce has been having me sign things, and I'm not always sure what they are. I told him I wanted to talk to you first. He said it was fine. I hope it's fine. Call me when you can, sweetheart. Deirdre was quiet for several seconds after it ended. Then she said, That's enough. The night before the mediation, I drove to Lexington one more time. I didn't go inside. I parked along the curb and looked at the house in the evening light. The pale yellow siding, the porch where my mother used to sit on warm evenings, the dogwood tree dark against the sky. I thought about the cedar chest and the journals, and the fact that my mother, who had not been able to stop what was happening to her, had kept a record of it in her careful evening hand, year after year, trusting in some wordless way that someone who knew how to read evidence would eventually come along and understand what she'd left. In the conference room the following morning, when my brother spoke and Stuckey reinforced the narrative they had built, I stayed still. I had my hands flat on the table. I looked at my brother while he spoke, and I did not react, not because I felt nothing, but because reaction would have been the wrong use of that moment. When he finished, Ms. Ames made a note on her legal pad. Then she looked at Stuckey. Counselor, before we continue, has your office conducted a thorough review of the opposing party's professional background and credentials? Stuckey straightened slightly. He's retired, he said. Structural engineering, federal government work. Ms. Ames removed her reading glasses. Federal government work, she repeated. Stuckey blinked once. I'd like to give you an opportunity, Ms. Ames said carefully, to address the document authentication analysis submitted this morning before we proceed, specifically the findings on the addendum and the signature comparison. Stuckey looked at the folder in front of him. He had received it. He had not read it carefully enough. Deirdre rose without urgency. She placed one hand on the table and addressed the room in the tone of someone with nothing to prove. The question before this mediation, she said, is whether the amended will accurately reflects my client's mother's wishes, or whether it reflects a period of documented cognitive vulnerability during which she was repeatedly asked to sign documents she did not fully understand. She paused. We intend to demonstrate the latter. We will do so through medical records, a certified neurologist's assessment of her capacity during the relevant period, journal entries in her own handwriting, a recorded voicemail she left for my client that was never deleted, testimony from her home care aide, and a forensic document analysis prepared by my client himself, a man who spent the final decade of his federal career leading the Army Corps of Engineers Documentation Integrity Program, and who has been qualified as an expert witness in 19 federal proceedings involving document fraud. The room was very quiet. My brother looked at me. It was the first time that morning he had looked at me directly. Ms. Ames turned back to Stuckey. Would counsel like a brief recess? We recessed for 20 minutes. When we returned, Stuckey had a different quality of attention. Deirdre walked through the evidence without drama and without haste. She presented the journal entries chronologically, noting each date against the documented progression of my mother's cognitive decline. She presented the neurologist's assessment. My mother's primary care physician had recorded what he described as significant executive processing impairment during the months surrounding the will's execution, a finding my mother's original estate attorney had never been informed of. She presented the notary log. She presented the aide's account. Then she played the voicemail. My mother's voice came through the room's small speaker in the particular way that voices from the dead arrive, unchanged and somehow wrong, a sound from a room you can no longer enter. My brother looked at the table when it finished and did not look up for a long time. Ms. Ames folded her hands. She looked at me. Mr. Silas, she said, I have one direct question. Of course, I said. When did you first suspect the amended will did not reflect your mother's actual wishes? I thought about the drive home from Lexington, the ink color, the witness line, the weight of recognizing a document that had been built to survive casual review and not careful review. The evening I first read it, I said, I recognize the pattern. I've encountered it in different contexts. The technique is the same. The motive differs, but the technique is the same. Ms. Ames was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her pen. I'm declining to ratify the amended will, she said. The evidence presented raises sufficient questions regarding cognitive capacity and undue influence to refer this matter to the county probate court for a full hearing. I will be recommending the appointment of an independent representative for the estate pending resolution. And I will be noting in my report that the role of the named witness on the amended instrument warrants the court's attention. My brother's chair was very still. Outside, Deirdre walked beside me to the elevator. The building's air conditioning hummed somewhere above us. She said what she said after proceedings like this, that this part was finished and the next part would take longer. I told her I was familiar with longer. My brother called that evening. He led not with an apology, but with grievance. A careful inventory of everything he had given in those 3 years, the time, the worry, the disruption to his own life. As if the question of what he had taken and the question of what he deserved were somehow the same. I listened to all of it before I said anything. What I said was, I'm not asking you to justify yourself to me. That's not my role here. The court has what it needs. Whatever comes next comes through the right channels. He said, you made me look like I stole from our own mother. I said, I presented what happened to our mother. What that looks like is not something I chose. He hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood at the window for a while, watching nothing in particular. I had been wrong about something, and I knew it. I had watched things in my own family for years. Small signs, small shifts in how my brother spoke about money, about the house, about what our mother would have wanted. And I had noted these observations the way I noted everything and said nothing, because I had trusted that what I couldn't yet prove wouldn't stay invisible forever. That trust was a failure of a different kind. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. Watching carefully is not the same as acting. I had confused the two for a long time. My sister-in-law retained her own attorney 3 days after the mediation. That was a useful response. It meant she understood the weight of what she'd witnessed and what she'd signed. My daughter called the morning after the hearing. She had known something was wrong since the funeral. She had said so, quietly, in the kitchen while the reception was still ongoing, telling me only that the new will felt sudden and that she didn't understand the timing. She hadn't pushed further because she wasn't sure she was right. Children who grow up watching their parents trust processes tend to trust processes too. I had given her that instinct, and I was not sure that morning whether it had served her. Did you know? She asked. I suspected. I wasn't certain until I went back and found the journals. She was quiet. Then Grandma kept journals? Since before you were born. She made a sound I couldn't quite classify then. What did she write? I told her about the entry where my mother said she'd signed something because she was tired, and her son said it was fine. I told her about the one where she'd asked if I should be present and been told I'd already agreed. My daughter didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, she tried to reach you. She did. And you didn't know. I didn't know. Another silence, then quietly, she knew you'd figure it out, Dad. I thought about the journals stored for decades in the cedar chest under the window. The key on a keychain left in the keeping of a neighbor my mother trusted. Millicent pressing that keychain into my hands at the reception without knowing what she was giving me, only knowing it should go to me. My mother had not been able to stop what was happening to her, but she had kept a record. She had, in her way, trusted that someone who understood documentation would eventually come along. She prepared for it, I said, in the way she knew how. The legal process moved at the pace these things always move, methodically, without sentiment, with the particular patience of systems designed to reach conclusions rather than comfort anyone. The probate court appointed an independent representative. The authentication analysis entered the record. The neurologist's findings were paired with medical documentation that described my mother's cognitive state during the relevant months with more precision than the opposing side had anticipated or prepared for. My sister-in-law reached a cooperation agreement 6 weeks into the proceeding. My brother rejected the first proposed resolution and the second. He hired a new attorney after Stuckey stepped back from the case. The new attorney had more energy and less to work with. The paper trail was what it was. Document fraud, when properly documented, closes exits the same way poor construction reveals itself under load, one failure point at a time, patiently, until the full picture is visible. My brother accepted a settlement 5 months after the mediation. The original will was reinstated. Restitution was ordered for transfers made from my mother's accounts during the 17 months in question. He retained his equal share. The same split my mother had intended 4 years earlier, when she had drawn up her wishes with her attorney present and her mind entirely her own. I was not satisfied in the way I had expected to be. Something closer to resolution, an open sentence finally given its period. My daughter flew in for a long weekend that spring. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. Her work, a camping trip she was planning, a book she'd brought on the flight. Before she left, she stood in the doorway a moment longer than usual. "I should have called more this year," she said. "So should I told her. She nodded. That was enough for now. I sold my mother's house in Lexington that autumn. On the last day before closing, I walked through the empty rooms. The cedar chest had been shipped to my apartment in Cincinnati, where it sat in the corner of my study. The bedroom without it looked larger and quieter than I had ever seen it. I stood at the window where the chest had been and held the brass key in my palm for a while. I had been carrying it since the day Millicent gave it to me. I put it back in my coat pocket. My mother was a quiet woman. She expressed things in writing and in the small, careful acts of her daily life, and in the way she kept records of things she thought might matter later. She had not been able to prevent what happened to her in those final months, but she had written it down every evening in her careful hand for 40 years, trusting that someone who understood documentation would eventually come looking. I want to be honest. I should have come sooner. I should have asked more questions when the signs were smaller, when asking might have been easier. Noticing things is not the same as doing something about them. I knew the difference in my professional life. I was slower to apply it at home. That is something I will carry. But I also know this. My mother prepared what she could. She left what needed to be found in a place she trusted I would know to look. And when the moment came, I was the right person to read what she had left. Not because I was the best son, or the most present one, or the one who had given the most of himself to those final years, but because she knew what I did for 31 years, and she trusted that the person she had watched grow up in that house would eventually understand what her journals were saying. I closed the door of the house on a cool October morning and stood on the porch for a moment in the still light. The dogwood tree had turned. The street was quiet. I allowed myself to feel what I had been too measured to feel for a long time. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something more specific. The satisfaction of having done the thing I was built to do in the only way I know how to do it. Quietly, completely. By reading what was there to be read, and trusting the truth to speak for itself in the language that suited it best. Paper doesn't forget what happens in quiet rooms. It doesn't rewrite itself to protect anyone. It holds what occurred and waits. And eventually, if the right person comes along, it speaks. I have spent a working life being that person. I did not expect to need to be that person inside my own family. But here we are. If you have ever been written off, quietly set aside, told that your distance counted as absence, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what time it is there. These are the stories worth keeping, and I have more of them.